Okay, welcome to Module 1, Part 3, 3 Significant Anthropological Observations Regarding Religion. The intent here is to introduce you to the academic approach to religions, which is quite a bit different from the typical believer's approach. We're looking at religions from the outside, so to speak. We will try not to be partial to any one particular religion. In fact, we will adopt the approach of cultural relativism, the idea that no one religion serves as a standard by which others are judged. So let's start with observation number 1. Religions are culture relative. As you can see from the slide, the first note states that religions are primarily responses to uncertainty, finitude, and mortality. And really, if you think about all the reasons why a person is religious, if we of course exclude the reason, quote, because they were born into it, unquote, and we think more along the lines of the development of religions, what sustains religious belief, things of that nature, uncertainty, finitude, and mortality go a long way towards explaining why people are religious. Of course, uncertainty just has to do with those aspects of our existence that seem to be beyond our empirical grasp. For example, what happens after we die, if anything? Is there a God? If there is a God, what is the nature of that God? What's expected of us by that God? Is there meaning and purpose to the universe? There's a great deal of uncertainty regarding all these issues, since really, honestly, no human being can claim to know the answers to these questions. But religion does give us some guidance and at least claims to give us some answers. Finitude. Finitude has to do with the fact that we are finite organic creatures and we live in a very intimidating, very scary world over which we have little control. And since we're not God or gods, we are sort of stuck here dealing with it as best we can. So we're finite creatures in this very scary, overwhelming place. And then finally, mortality is self-explanatory. We are born, we grow old, we get sick, we die. These are the brutal facts of nature that we have to come to grips with psychologically and existentially. And of course, once again, religion at least claims to give us answers to the problem of mortality. Next note has to do with the sheer number of religions that exist today around the world. About 10,500 distinct religions at last count. If we were to factor in the sects and the denominations, the number would be far greater than that. And the simplest way to put this is that, as the note says, this diversity we find in religions is simply a reflection of the diversity of cultures. And precisely why that's the case can be seen in the very next note on the next slide. These issues we discussed earlier, uncertainty, finitude, mortality, everyone has to deal with them in some way. And it only makes sense that people are going to be dealing with these issues in ways that are culturally meaningful to them. In other words, they're going to embrace responses and solutions to these problems that make sense to them given their cultural and historical and even environmental frame of reference. Hence, the diversity of world religions. So, as it turns out, religions are very intimately linked to the culture, history, and even environment of the areas in which they originated. Okay, let's move on to observation number 2. Matters of faith and dogma cannot be empirically substantiated. I'm sure most of you can probably grasp the general point that's being made here. When we talk about matters of faith and dogma, we're not talking about the sort of facts that we may cover in a physics class or a genetics class or a chemistry class. We're talking about something that's very, very different. And in fact, these are claims that cannot be empirically substantiated, just simply meaning that they can't be proven the way that other facts about our world are proven. That doesn't mean they're false necessarily. Certainly doesn't mean they're true either. It just sort of means they hang out there in this ether of uncertainty, so to speak. Believers tend to obviously embrace them, whereas critics tend to reject them primarily for that reason. The first note you can see reads that religion focuses almost exclusively on the transcendental realm, which is a supernatural or preternatural dimension that is not accessible to us. It's assumed that there is another space, quote unquote, out there in which gods and spirits and demons and angels all reside, and that the soul will eventually ascend to after death. But the important point here is that it's a realm of existence, if it does exist at all, that is totally apart from the one that we inhabit. In fact, some critics feel that the word supernatural itself is nonsensical, since we're talking about something that we can't access, something we've never seen, some place we've never been to, etc. It's strictly nonsensical, say the critics. And as you can see from the next note, when you start making claims regarding the supernatural, well, technically, the claims you're making are non-falsifiable, which simply means that there's no test, no experiment, no data that you could run or collect or whatever that will falsify that notion. The rule of falsifiability, in fact, states that the statements that are not falsifiable are meaningless. Not necessarily true or false, just simply meaningless. In other words, we can't really get at them in any substantive way. Once again, believers tend to accept them, critics tend to reject them. Now, precisely why that's the case can be seen in the next slide. The T1, T sub 1, T sub 2, T sub 3, and T sub n. This stands for the sort of temporary contingent truths that science moves through. So, for example, T sub 1 could be the Ptolemaic geocentric theory of the solar system with its epicycles and so forth. Pretty brilliant, but yet incorrect. T sub 2 would move us to Copernicus's advances in solar system astronomy, when he argued that the sun is the center of the solar system, so we get the heliocentric universe. And then, of course, later, T sub 3, T sub n, we're moving into an even more complex understanding of our solar system as being actually located in sort of the backwaters of our galaxy, and our galaxy is merely one of billions that are out there. Anyway, so science moves that way. You can look at a T sub 1 being Aristotelian physics. You can move up to T sub 2 being Newtonian physics and his laws of motion. T sub 3 would get us into quantum mechanics and so forth. T sub 4 could be string theory. Anyway, the point being that science progresses in very small incremental steps, and science gets us better and better versions of the truth. But you'll see that it terminates at T sub n. In other words, the assumption is that science will always improve upon the knowledge we have today. But we'll never get to a big T truth. That's the basic assumption that science works upon. After all, science involves primarily the attempt to falsify current knowledge. I mean, science is always involved in falsification, or at least attempt to falsify current knowledge, and that's how science progresses. So T sub 1, T sub 2, T sub 3, T sub n and that's as far as we go. Nothing absolute is assumed, and that's where science stands. Now, the situation is quite different with religion. With religion, there is an assumption that we do in fact have the absolute truth. And of course, believers will claim to have absolute truth regarding the nature of God, the afterlife, the human soul, etc. And so as you can see, religion takes that leap, a leap of faith, if you will, from T sub n to truth. It's almost as if religion can't wait. Religion is impatient. So I guess there's a sort of a good news, bad news situation here. Science gives us reliable yet contingent small t truths, whereas religion at least claims to give us the absolute truth. But we certainly wouldn't attach the word reliable to these religious truths, since, if you recall, there are 10,500 different versions of religion, all with many, many different solutions to the problems of existence. Just a word or two about this data-based epistemology you see there that'll help us understand this situation a little bit better. Whereas the data-based epistemology is primarily empirical, in other words, it's real world based on observation, experimentation, measurement, and so forth. It's empirical and inductive. Inductive meaning that you do go out, you collect data, you measure things, you weigh things, you observe things, and then you come up with hypotheses that you hope you can confirm. And a number of these hypotheses together comprise a theory eventually, which is a set of coherent hypotheses that have stood the test of time. So, for example, the theory of evolution, which is comprised of a number of different hypotheses, all of which have stood the test of time quite well. Whereas in the faith-based epistemology, there essentially is no induction involved at all. People aren't testing hypotheses. They don't come up with new theories. There is an assumptive sort of ideology at work here, since it's assumed that they have the truth. Of course, that is attributed to the fact that many believers point to a holy book that they believe is inspired by God. Another sort of contrasting feature has to do with tradition and authority. In regard to the data-based epistemology, tradition and authority are just sort of give us kind of like maybe just the foundation, a sort of a jumping off point. But certainly tradition and authority are not respected if new data should turn up that disconfirm traditional ideas, the ideas of authorities, etc. Quite the opposite with the faith-based epistemology, where tradition and authority, in fact, can be the final word. People will point to religious authorities, the church fathers, etc., and read them authoritatively even today. And then the rule of falsifiability I mentioned a while ago. The science takes the rule of falsifiability very, very seriously. Once again, the idea that statements that are not falsifiable are meaningless. In science, if you make a claim, you had better be ready to document it. You had better be ready for other people to, in fact, confirm your findings, because everyone's going to be throwing darts at it and trying to disconfirm it, trying to falsify it. But in the realm of faith-based epistemology, the rule of falsifiability actually plays no role whatsoever. Claims, for example, such as the angel Gabriel spoke to Muhammad for the first time in 610 CE on behalf of Allah, is a classic non-falsifiable statement. There's not really much you can do with it other than accept it or reject it. Many other claims in religion fall in the same category here. claims of reincarnation, for example, are not falsifiable. Claims that we live on after death are not falsifiable either. So the rule of falsifiability, important in science and the database epistemology, and not so in the faith-based epistemology. And then finally, one last point, the database epistemology gives us knowledge that is universal. In other words, the entire world shares in knowledge that is produced by the database epistemology. And so that is why Chinese physicists and Canadian physicists and Nigerian physicists are all pretty much working under the same basic laws and principles. The same thing can be said for chemistry, genetics, mathematics, astronomy. All of these things are universally shared, universally agreed upon. And that has everything to do with what I've mentioned thus far, the fact that the database epistemology is inductive, it's empirical, the rule of falsifiability is important, etc. So we have this sort of universality of knowledge here that we do not see with the faith-based epistemology, because the faith-based epistemology is frankly not tied to the empirical world we live in. The fact that there are 10,500 different religions is not at all surprising, given the basic characteristics of the faith-based epistemology. So, whereas the database epistemology gives us universal knowledge, faith-based epistemology gives us cultural ideologies. Then finally, observation number 3, religions generally do not spread outside their area of origin. And by this point, given what I've said thus far, it should be pretty easy to figure out why. Religions are very, very cultural, since they're not really tied to the empirical world we live in, and this cultural diversity is reflected in the fact that they generally tend not to spread. So, for example, consider Hinduism. Hinduism is one of the great ancient religions, about 4,000 years old, best we can tell. Very, very rich, very complex religion with the huge corpus of written tales and teachings and principles and so forth. Yet Hinduism has been pretty much stuck in one place, India and Greater India, for about 4,000 years. Now that's a pretty extreme example, but in fact that is pretty much the case for every religion that we know of. Religions just tend to be a bit too intimately linked to a particular language, a particular culture, even a particular diet, etc., to disseminate from its point of origin. Now contrast that with, for example, the sort of knowledge that's produced by the database epistemology, for example, the Pythagorean theorem. We can imagine that this very, very practical, very useful idea spread like wildfire. Once it was shown to someone else, I'm sure they immediately saw the utility of the idea and embraced it and used it. And we know for a fact that this has happened with, for example, calculus, invented by Newton. I mean, it disseminated about as fast as people could take it in. And that has everything to do with the universal nature, though, of this sort of knowledge. Well, not the case with religions. The religion is going to be a very hard sell because they're so cultural for all of the reasons that we've discussed thus far. But you can see there's a note here, though, that tells us that there are 5 exceptions. It's not many. Out of 10,500, there are 5 exceptions. So we could call this a pretty good general rule. Nevertheless, we should address the 5 exceptions. And you can see there are Christianity, Islam, Judaism, African-derived religions in the New World, and Buddhism. The first 4 are really easy to understand because they all involve a movement of people, in some cases a very dominant people, And just as a byproduct of people moving around, their religions moved with them. So Christianity, for example, the number one reason why Christianity is a global religion today has everything to do with European colonization. That is the time period during which Christianity gained a foothold in North America, South America, Africa, Australia, etc. And that is the primary reason why Christianity is a global religion today and has a significant presence in all the major geographical areas of the world. A very dominant, organized, technologically sophisticated people colonized the world, and they simply brought their religion with them. In the case of Islam, it's not that much different. Here we had a very, very powerful, very organized people. Islam spread from Saudi Arabia. It began, I guess you could mark it at 622, a little bit more about that later, but and by 750, in other words, about 128 years later, Islam had spread all the way across North Africa into Spain, well, the Iberian Peninsula, and all the way to the east to the border of the western border of India. And again, just a very organized, very determined people, just kind of bulldozing cultures as they went. Now, that's a generalization, but overall, that's a pretty good general description of what happened. Just a very dominant people who managed to subjugate people as they migrated eastward and westward, and they brought their religion with them. Judaism, of course, was not spread by virtue of imperialism or colonization or anything like that. Jews have been routinely exiled and ostracized and forced to migrate throughout history. And of course, in every case, they brought their religion with them. The African-derived religions in the New World, here we're talking about Voodoo in Haiti, which became Voodoo in the American South. Orisha, the religion I study. Also, you may have heard of Santeria. These are all religions that originated in sub-Saharan West Africa, but were brought to the New World by the Africans that were enslaved during the Middle Passage, some 11 million of them, who were brought to the New World, and they simply brought their religions with them and managed to hold on to them and pass them down generation after generation, and they've survived until today. But then finally we arrive at the most interesting case in my mind, and that's Buddhism. The spread of Buddhism, while it did involve a little bit of missionary work, there was basically no mass movement of people. There were no wars. There was no forced migration, no dominant people rampaging over the landscape, bringing their religion with them, forcing their religion on other people. Buddhism actually turns out to be the only major world religion that was spread almost exclusively as an idea. In other words, it spread almost simply on the strength of its ideology, and not as a result of a mass movement of people and armies, etc. So Buddhism is a very interesting case in this regard.